What would you do if a lawyer told you that you had one single day to find a wife? My name is Andrew Collins. I'm 34 years old, and 3 months ago, I was sitting in a leather chair in Denver, Colorado, listening to a man in a gray suit explain that my dead uncle had turned my life into a countdown. Frank Collins raised me every summer of my childhood at a lodge in the Rocky Mountains, a place that smelled like pine smoke and wet cedar, where he taught me to fish before he taught me to drive, where I learned that silence between two people who trust each other is its own kind of conversation. When he passed, I assumed the lodge would simply come to me, the way inheritances usually do. I was wrong. The attorney slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and told me that according to my uncle's will, I had to be legally married by 5 o'clock the following day, or ownership of the lodge would transfer permanently to a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, a man named Victor who had already listed it with 3 different real estate agents before the funeral flowers had wilted. I laughed at first because it sounded like the setup to a bad joke, but the lawyer didn't laugh back, and that's when I understood my uncle, even from the grave, was still trying to teach me something about what actually mattered. I spent that entire afternoon doing the kind of things a desperate man does when logic has already failed him. I called 2 ex-girlfriends who hung up before I finished the sentence. I opened a dating app I'd deleted a year earlier and stared at it like it might somehow solve a legal problem in 22 hours. I even considered asking my assistant, which should tell you exactly how far gone I was by 6 that evening. By the time the sun dropped behind the Denver skyline, I was sitting alone in a corner booth of a small cafe 2 blocks from my office, phone pressed to my ear, trying to explain the entire absurd situation to my business partner, who kept saying the word "what" in increasingly higher pitches. I didn't notice the woman at the next table until I'd already said, out loud in public, "I need a wife by tomorrow." That's when I heard her laugh, not unkindly, more like someone who'd overheard something so strange she couldn't help herself. Her name was Lily Harper. She was a school teacher, mid-20s, stack of essays in front of her, red pen still in hand. And when I turned to apologize for interrupting her evening with my meltdown, she asked one simple question. Is that a metaphor, or do you actually need a wife by tomorrow? I told her everything, the lodge, the will, the deadline, the cousin already circling like a vulture in a blazer, and instead of standing up and walking to another table like any reasonable person would, she leaned forward, elbows on the table, studying me the way I imagined she studied a student she couldn't quite figure out. An hour passed, then 2. The cafe employees started stacking chairs around us, and we barely noticed. At some point I said it again, quieter this time, almost like a real question instead of a punchline. I need a wife by tomorrow. Lily didn't laugh the second time. She reached into her canvas bag, pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper that already had creases worn soft from being opened and closed, and slid it across the table toward me. Only if you promise me these things, she whispered. And I remember thinking that whatever was written on that paper was about to make my impossible day even more complicated. I unfolded it slowly. I expected demands about money, about protection, about an exit clause that guaranteed she'd walk away untouched if this whole arrangement blew up in both our faces. Instead, I found 5 handwritten lines that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with character. She wanted honesty, even when honesty was inconvenient. She wanted respect, the kind that doesn't disappear once cameras or witnesses are gone. She wanted patience, especially on the days neither of us felt like being patient. She wanted a partner who wouldn't disappear into work the way she suspected I already had for years. And the 5th promise was the one that stopped me cold, the one I read 3 times before I looked back up at her. No matter how busy my life became, I had to make real time for people who needed help, the way my uncle apparently once made time for a scared, broke 17-year-old version of Lily's own mother, back when he still ran a small hardware store in town, a story Lily only told me weeks later, once trust had quietly become something real between us. I signed that paper in a cafe booth at 11 at night, less than 18 hours before the deadline, and I remember my hand shaking, not because I doubted the arrangement, but because some part of me already sensed I was agreeing to something far bigger than a lodge. The next morning we stood in front of a courthouse clerk who looked at both of us like we were either eloping lovers or 2 people committing light fraud, and honestly, at that point, even I wasn't entirely sure which one was true. We said our vows fast, almost breathless, 40 minutes before the deadline expired, and when the clerk pronounced us married, Lily squeezed my hand once, hard, like she was sealing a promise rather than celebrating a wedding. I called the lawyer from the courthouse steps. Victor's name disappeared from every future conversation about the lodge that day. I thought that was the end of the story. It was only the beginning. What I didn't expect was how seriously Lily intended to hold me to that folded piece of paper. Within 2 weeks she had me at a school fundraiser I would have skipped a month earlier, standing awkwardly near a punch bowl while 8-year-olds asked me why I was wearing a suit to a bake sale. Within a month I was helping fund new classroom supplies for a program that had been quietly starving for donors. Not because it made good press, but because Lily mentioned one tired, underpaid teacher by name, and I couldn't stop thinking about her afterward. Within 2 months, I noticed something strange happening to my calendar. Meetings that once felt urgent started feeling smaller. Evenings I used to spend answering emails I started spending at a folding table in a school gymnasium, helping kids with math homework while their parents worked late shifts. Lily never lectured me about it. She simply lived the fifth promise so consistently that eventually I wanted to live it too, not because a lawyer required it, but because I liked the version of myself that showed up. We laughed more than two people in a legal arrangement have any right to laugh. She teased me mercilessly about my $200 dress shirts getting flour on them during a bake sale disaster. I teased her right back about grading papers at 11 at night with a red pen clenched like a weapon. Somewhere between the fundraiser and the first real snowfall, the arrangement stopped feeling like an arrangement at all, and started feeling like a life I hadn't known I was missing. Legally, the requirement had already been satisfied the moment that clerk signed our certificate. Emotionally, I had somehow married a woman who was quietly rebuilding parts of me I didn't know were broken. It wasn't all easy though, and I want to be honest about that part too, because Lily made honesty one of her 5 conditions, and I intend to keep it even now, telling this story. Victor didn't disappear quietly. 3 weeks after the wedding, my phone rang at 6 in the morning, and it was a lawyer I'd never heard of, informing me that Victor intended to challenge the marriage as fraudulent, calling it a transparent scheme designed purely to dodge the will's intent. For 2 tense weeks, I genuinely didn't know whether the lodge, or the marriage protecting it, would survive a courtroom. Lily sat beside me through every phone call, every stack of paperwork, every late night with the family attorney spread across our kitchen table, and she never once flinched or asked whether this had all become more trouble than it was worth. When Victor finally showed up in person, uninvited, standing on the lodge's front steps in an expensive coat that looked wildly out of place against the pine trees, he looked Lily up and down like she was a prop I'd rented for the occasion. "How much is he paying you?" he asked her flatly, not even bothering to disguise the accusation. Lily didn't raise her voice. She simply told him that some things in this family clearly skipped straight past him, folded her arms, and said she wasn't going anywhere, not because of a will, but because she'd chosen to be there. Victor left within the hour, and his lawyer quietly dropped the challenge 2 weeks later once it became obvious there was nothing fraudulent to find. Only 2 people who had genuinely built something real out of an arrangement that started as a legal technicality. I remember watching her stand on those steps, unshaken, defending a marriage that had started as a favor, and thinking that whatever was happening between us had already stopped being about the lodge entirely, even if neither of us had said so out loud yet. Then came the morning everything almost fell apart. I drove up to the lodge alone to handle some paperwork with the property manager, and when I came back down that evening, Lily's overnight bag was sitting by the front door, packed, zipped, waiting. She told me, calmly, almost too calmly, that since the will's condition was fulfilled, and neither of us had ever promised forever, she thought it was fair to let me go back to my real life before either of us got hurt any further than we probably already were. I stood there holding my car keys, staring at that bag, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with mountains or inheritance. I told her to wait exactly 1 hour, and I drove her, without much explanation, back up to the lodge itself, the same porch where my uncle used to sit every evening with 2 mugs of black coffee, one for himself and one he always left empty, like he was still waiting for someone. I took Lily's hands in mine on that same porch, and I told her the truth, the whole truth, the kind she'd asked me to promise on a folded piece of paper in a cafe booth months earlier. I told her I no longer cared what the will required. I told her I had kept 4 of her 5 promises because I respected her, and I was terrified of breaking the 5th one, which was never actually written down, the unspoken promise that had grown between us without either of us signing anything. "I needed a wife to save this lodge," I said, my voice cracking in a way I hadn't allowed it to crack in years. "But somewhere along the way, you became the reason I actually want to keep it." Lily didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked past me at the mountains, then back at my face, tears sliding down before she even tried to stop them. I only gave you that list because I was terrified of getting hurt by someone who didn't know how to stay, she finally whispered. I never expected the man who needed a wife by tomorrow to become the man I couldn't imagine tomorrow without. We're still at that lodge most weekends now, and there's a second mug of coffee on that porch every single morning, except this one never sits empty. My uncle's strange, impossible, infuriating condition turned out to be the smartest thing anyone in my family ever did because he didn't just save a piece of mountain property from a distant cousin's real estate ambitions. He handed me, without either of us realizing it, the one relationship in my life I never knew I was desperate enough to need.